Did you have your parrotfish? Senor, did you have your parrotfish?
No, we did not. We had so we didn't eat any turkey. We just ate tininon manok, barbecue chicken, hinexagaga, red rice, kelaguen manok. We just had a sort of nice Chamorro food today. My dad was like, "What?" My dad was like, "Shouldn't we have a turkey?" And I'm like, "Why? Why? What would the purpose of that be?" Because I don't know. As I've mentioned before, Thanksgiving has only been celebrated by Chamorros for a few generations. And when it came in, Chamorros were, just told, and this is, what you're supposed to celebrate. This is when you celebrate that you're thankful for something. And at first, Chamorros were resistant to these holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving. Sort of, now there's not much documentation of it because, Chamorros didn't feel like they had a lot of agency or power, but they didn't like it that their kids were being told that this is how you're supposed to show appreciation, or that you're supposed to get gifts, for this or for that. And it was at that time, they didn't like it because it was taking away the religious dimensions to how Chamorros believe those things, right? That Christmas is not about getting gifts, right? It's about celebrating the birth of Jesus. And so people might give some gifts around that time, but gifts weren't the most important thing at all, and the same thing for Christmas. People were like, "What is this? This is not our history." But then eventually, within a couple generations, people accept that it's a regular part. But I always say that even for holidays like this, Chamorros should come up with their own connections to these things, right? So just as we see people across the US reimagine Columbus Day for Indigenous Peoples Day, you could do something very similar for Thanksgiving, because it is important to have a day where you can give thanks and show appreciation, but it doesn't have to be tied to the pilgrims at all in order to do that. It doesn't have to be tied to that. All right, but anyways, today we have the mina'gualo, number 8 on our journey. And today we are learning about Brigadier General Vicente Garrido Blaz. And so we've talked about sort of different, so for the past couple times, we focused on people who are World War II survivors, people who sort of were born and lived a fair amount of their life before World War II, and then sort of, came into sort of adulthood after the war or during the war. So, and we're getting younger and younger, sort of Pale Dueñas to Clotilde Gould to now Ben Blaz. And so when we're talking about the legacy of somebody like Ben Blaz, he was a very accomplished person. We're going to talk about a lot of his accomplishments. And his biography is something that he used very effectively in his life to tell his story, but also to tell the story of the Chamorro people, his people. And so, but we're also going to get into some of the contradictions around sort of his life as well. In essence, sort of his accomplishments as sort of within an American context, but also his accomplishments within a Chamorro context. And how he was also somebody who used his own experiences as well as the experiences of his parents and his grandparents, his elders, to talk about the discrimination that Chamorros faced, the injustices that they faced, and so on. And so I always so there's a lot of different reasons to talk about him, and we're going to get through some of them today, but there's a lot more that we could talk about. Now, one of the things that makes Ben Blaz different than just about everybody else that we've talked about so far is that he wrote a lot. He produced a lot. He wrote 2 books. He produced documentary series. There's even websites which have his writings on them. He, of course, made speeches in the US Congress, so you can read his words in the Congressional Record. He also had articles in magazines. He also wrote a master's thesis. And so when you're talking about somebody like him, there's a lot of things to sift through. But one of the nice things about Ben Blaz is that he really saw himself as a warrior. He was a soldier, but he was part of that tradition where they oftentimes call themselves warrior scholars. So that he also saw that being a warrior doesn't mean that you don't think, but actually that if you are put into a position of leadership, it's your responsibility to think, to read, to write, and to do better, to think more and to be better, not just sort of accept the way you are. And so he definitely exemplified that. And so these are his two books, Visita Guam, A Special Place in the Sun, which he later turned into a documentary. And that, of course, is like his Guam history book. It has little short vignettes from different periods in Guam history. And then Visita Guam, Let Us Remember Nihitahasu, which is his sort of autobiography and his memoirs from World War II. And one thing I was struggling between whether to sort of talk about him or Tony Palomo, because both of them felt the need to speak for their generation, speak on behalf of the World War II Chamorro generation, to give voice to those experiences. And so as a young man, growing up before World War II, one of the things that Ben Blaz writes about is sort of the pervasiveness of the military, and then him feeling and associating very positive things with the military, sort of liking the niceness of their uniforms, sort of listening to the way that they spoke English. Now, he, of course, grew up in a period where the educational system was very much about Americanization, as we've talked about in the past. And so you were taught that America was the greatest, English was the best language, and so on. And so he definitely lived in that time. And he associated the US military in particular with sort of high values and great importance in life. Now, one of the things that was very important to him, though, was receiving sort of a critical understanding, or at least critical insights from the world, from his father, known as Tun Bendero, Vicente Cruz Blaz. And so Tun Bendero had been, so by the time of World War II, there was several hundred Chamorros that were serving in the US Navy, and a very small number of Chamorros that had served in other branches of the US military. But Tun Bendero, he served before World War I, sort of around that time when there was still relatively few Chamorros compared to the larger population who were serving in the US military. On that time, it was difficult for Chamorros to join from Guam. The US Navy didn't really want them. But then those who ended up in the States oftentimes joined. That's why, for example, there's evidence that there may have been less than half a dozen Chamorros who fought in the US Civil War, because they had made it out to the States. And when they had sort of signed up, they had put Guam as their place of birth. And so Chamorros, because the way that they would leave Guam is on sailing ships, they often ended up in the Navy or as whalers and so on, connected to that life. But what's fascinating, and one of the things that I want us to remember about Ben Blaz is that he knew his father's stories. He talked to his father, his parents, his grandparents, but he also used them to help understand history and his own reality. And sort of this is one thing that I want us all to think about, is that whatever stories we get from our parents and our grandparents, they're not a college professor, or they're not a community activist necessarily. And so they're not going to highlight that these are the big important points, or this is the truth that you need to understand. But over the course of his writings, what Ben Blaz did is that he worked to try to figure out, from the experiences of his father and his grandfather in particular, what were the truths and the hard truths and the injustices that they faced, and what are the things that we can learn from them. And so Blaz writes about his father's experiences, where his father grew up in Guam under the Spanish and then under the United States. And at that time, Chamorros were treated sort of as inferior. They were not US citizens. They could join the US Navy, but they could only join on the lowest levels. Now, sometimes Chamorros were able to get through and join some of the higher levels. You still couldn't, of course, be like an officer or anything like that. But instead of being just a cook, sometimes you might be like a boatswain. And so some like Tunbendero and even the former governor Joseph Flores were able to do that, become like yeomen. And so when Tunbendero went to the States as part of the Navy, one of the things that shocked him was that when he was stationed in the southern United States, was the way that African Americans were treated by white Americans. For him, it was shocking because African Americans at that time were US citizens, but they could be treated as less than whites. And so when he was appalled that when he traveled in places like Virginia, for example, there would be signs everywhere which would indicate that whites could use this water fountain, coloreds had to use this water fountain, or that even that a hotel might have a sign in which they indicated that the restrooms are segregated, and that was a good thing. Sort of that Black people don't get to use these restrooms, and so that's why we are a clean establishment. And so it shocked him, and it made him self-conscious about his own experience. He tried to sort of avoid. It made him conscious about his own place in the racial hierarchy, but it did make him question sort of, what are we to the United States? And he would ask his son that sort of on several occasions for the rest of his life. What are we to the United States if this is what we are? His father also experienced an interesting form of discrimination, where there was two Vicente Cruz Blazes serving on the same ship in the US Navy. And the paymaster wanted it to be easier to tell them apart, so he insisted that one of them had to change their name. And so they were both spelled with the last name Blas, and Tunbendero lost the bet, and he had to change his name to a Z, whereas the other got to keep the S. So when the time of the Japanese occupation happened, Ben Blas was already sort of a teen. And if you read his book, Nihitahasu, he talks a lot about his experiences, and he really tries to be a voice for his generation and for the Chamorro people, talking about how powerful, how valuable the sense of community was, how people took care of each other, the quiet heroism, and also the more direct forms of heroism. And so he, like most other people, suffered. He was at the age where he had, of course, he was forced labor. He had to go do forced labor for the Japanese. But one thing that he notes is that, and this is an important sort of thing, is that the war reminded Chamorros about the value of their land. And so by 1941, Chamorros were still connected to the land, but they were embracing more and more sort of a consumeristic lifestyle. There was lots of mom and pop stores at that time which sold canned goods, imported food, and Chamorros were getting more and more into that sort of lifestyle. But the war, at least for the moment, reminded Chamorros about the importance of being close to the land, because for 2.5 years, the island was cut off, no more imports. And in fact, whatever you produced might be taken by the Japanese. And so Chamorros returned to the jungles, and they had to find new ways to sustain and support themselves. And so in his book, he writes about a number of ways that since you couldn't buy things in the stores anymore, Chamorros would still try to adapt. Like, for example, he says that because there was no more coffee that you could import or buy from the store, Chamorros would find different things to try to make, to try to simulate coffee. And that because you couldn't buy clothes in the store, but you needed clothes, Chamorro's return to sort of taking different fibers and pounding it and trying to create cloth. And in fact, his family, they used pineapple leaves. They used pineapple leaves to try to create cloth because they couldn't buy any more in the store. But one of the unfortunate things, though, is that return to the land for those who survived the war, in some ways, then becomes associated with trauma and tragedy and hardship. So rather than teaching those lessons of survival to their children, a lot of those who survived the war feel that life should be left behind, and instead you should just fully embrace sort of a modern consumeristic buy it in the store lifestyle. So one thing that Blaz notes is that there wasn't a lot of ways to fight back against the Japanese, but the language, the use of the Chamorro language was one way that you could do it. And he and others hated it that they had to bow to the Japanese. And he wrote that from the onset, we saw bowing as a means to humiliate us, to make us demonstrate our abject inferiority in the face of conquerors' preeminence. For that reason, we turned the bows into insults. We would stiffly bend at the waist and cheerily declare in Chamorro, "Good morning, asshole." And now this was one of my favorites. "Now that I'm bending over, kiss my ass." So he notes, though, that they could only do this if there was no interpreters from the Northern Marianas around, but that him and his friends got into the habit of, and we talked about this previously with Clotilde Gould as well, that whenever it was just the Japanese, as long as you were smiling and respectful and you sounded like you were an exuberantly, an enthusiastic patriot of the Japanese Empire, you could tell them any sort of disgustingly sexual thing that they should do to themselves. And they would bow back to you and they would acknowledge that you were a respectful boy because you had said it in such a way. And so this is something that it's good that Blaz recognizes this, that the sovereignty of the language is that even when sometimes people say that they want Google Translate to be able to translate Chamorro, for me, I'm kind of like, I don't know if I want that. I don't know. I don't necessarily know if I want people who can't understand Chamorro to actually know what we're saying. I kind of like it if we can say stuff and only those who can speak Chamorro can understand it. It's weird if somebody can come along and then just figure out what you and your community is saying without actually doing the work to learn the language. And so Blaz writes a lot about what the Chamorro spirit was at that time, but one of his most noted quotes is that the Chamorro spirit during the war was not an abstraction. Rather, it was demonstrably real during those years, and that he has drawn inspiration and sustenance from that reality his entire life. And so this is something that he took later on in his life very seriously, especially when he went to Congress, was telling the story of the Chamorro people that suffered for the United States in war and trying to get America to give a damn about those people. So after the war, Ben Blaz joined a number of other Chamorros, and it was an increasing number by that point, who went to the States for education. This is these are all people that received scholarships to go to the States and sort of get their college education because there was no colleges on Guam. And those who had gotten college education before the war had either come from wealthy families or they had taken college classes via correspondence in the mail. And so Blaz, you can see he's right here, right there. And so he does tell a funny story about when he got on the ship. And a lot of Chamorros at that time had similar funny stories about how he went to the States and that he was supposed to go to Notre Dame, right? He was supposed to go to Notre Dame. He got off the ship in San Francisco. He got a taxi and he told the person in the taxi, "Take me to Notre Dame." And the person in the taxi looked at him and said, "Are you sure?" And he's like, yeah, I'm going to Notre Dame. So the taxi took him to a girls' school, a girls' boarding school in the Bay Area called Notre Dame. And then he went in there and he said, "I'm supposed to go to school here." And sort of the the nuns there told him, no, you're definitely not supposed to go to school here. And he's like, yeah, I'm supposed to go to Notre Dame. And they're like, no. You need to go to the train station. And so they went back to the taxi and they told him then, and they gave instructions. And so then Ben Blaz got on a taxi and for a couple more days traveled closer to the middle of the country where the more famous Notre Dame is. After college, he would immediately join and he would spend a good chunk of his life in the US Marine Corps. And in the US Marine Corps, he would serve with distinction and he would be promoted heavily and he would make history in that he would become the first non-white officer to achieve the rank of Brigadier General in the US Marine Corps. He would also sort of receive the highest honor that he received a number of sort of medals and commendations for his service in Vietnam. But for him, the highest honor, though, was when he gained command of, I think it's the 9th Regiment. I can't remember off the top of my head. But when he gained command of one of the units which helped liberate Guam from Japanese occupation. So he saw that as, because he had, in the ashes of World War II, seen those Marines and thought that they were awesome and powerful, that they were godlike liberators, sort of giants among men. And so when he had the honor of leading that same unit, he felt that that was sort of his crowning achievement. So one of the things that Blaz and those before him and those after him, one of the things that they sort of indicate is sort of this idea of Chamorros as being very elite in military service, Iman Matua, the elites. And so in the article by Keith Camacho and Laura Manig, Uncomfortable Fatigues, they quote Olimpio Megofnia, who was a US Army recruiter in Guam. And he said, let me tell you something about Chamorros. They are some of the most decorated, motivated, sophisticated soldiers in the world, man. When they join any of the armed forces, they are there to prove themselves. So when we go into the military, we tend to be the best of the best. And I hear this from everyone else, from sergeant majors, from generals. And so from that generation, we kind of saw that. Chamorros had largely tried to join the US Navy initially because of that was the part of the US military that they were the most familiar with, the US Navy. And so, but the US Navy had a very low and very hard ceiling, especially sort of in the decade running up to World War II. You joined the Navy, but the racial restrictions said that you had to be a cook or a servant, an attendant. And so some Chamorros, especially those who had left the island to go to school in the States, when they would try to join the military, especially in light of Guam being taken by the Japanese, they would oftentimes try to join the Navy and then give up when they would realize that even if they scored higher than a white person, they could never be higher than a white person in the Navy. And so we see, for example, Carlos Taitano later became Speaker of the Guam legislature. He was the first Chamorro to be an officer in the US Army and served with distinction. And here we have Ben Blaz in the middle, and next to him is Pete Siguenza, who was the first Chamorro to be an officer in the US Marines. He was even part of the honor guard for Franklin Delano Roosevelt's funeral. Siguenza, and so both Taitano and Siguenza were in the States when the war had broken out, and they had tried to join the Navy, and they were told that all you get to be is a cook, even if they scored really well on their aptitude tests. And so both of them, Siguenza, for example, tore up his rating from the Navy and joined the Marines instead. And so Ben Blaz was sort of part of this tradition of Chamorros doing very, very well in the US military. Chamorros, even in the Vietnam era, sort of set records. For example, one of the first non-white, sort of one of the first mess attendants to receive a change in rating from enlisted to sort of was another Chamorro, Esteban Torres. Frank Torres, who served in the army, another sort of highly distinguished man, a contemporary of Ben Blaz. And then on the right here, we have Pete Gumatautau, who sort of became, who reached the highest echelons of the US Navy very recently. And so after retiring from the military, Ben Blaz decided to get into politics on Guam. Now, he had spent, by this time, most of his life not in Guam. He had spent his life in the States, around the world, and that he called sort of the area around Washington, D.C. his home. But he decided to get into politics to challenge Tony Wampat, who had been the longest serving elected public official on Guam. Tony Wampat had served in the advisory congresses before World War II. He had served in the Guam Congress and Assembly after World War II. He had served as the Speaker of the Guam legislature for many times. He was elected as Guam's non-voting delegate. And he had served there for 10 years when finally he was unseated by Ben Blaz. Ben Blaz's rationale for running against Tony Wampat, who was such a political institution at that time, you know, is that he was getting the feeling like that Washington, D.C. didn't understand sort of the issues in Guam, didn't understand the unique needs and the unique culture of the people of Guam. And he felt that not enough was being done to ensure that people on Guam are treated equal as the rest of the United States. When he first ran against Tony Wampat, he lost, although on the second time around, he was able to defeat him. And so in Congress, as the non-voting delegate, Ben Blaz was a very loud voice, but he wasn't necessarily the most effective voice. He was a Republican at a time when Democrats largely controlled the Congress. And so he was not able to get many laws passed. He was not able to sort of get a lot done on what he wanted to. But he was somebody who was known sort of embodying the persona of the general or the soldier in his outreach for Guam. And so he became somebody who strongly connected his war experience and his military service to sort of the experience of Chamorros in Guam, and insisting that they deserved something better. And so, for example, this excerpt here is from a hearing that was about the base issue in the Philippines in 1991. So we're talking about sort of Subic Bay, you know, the issue of the leases there, the leases between the Philippines and the US over the bases there. And he was frustrated at sort of the lack of knowledge of the lack of knowledge about some of his colleagues in Congress, and then also the way in which they didn't seem to take their own jobs or the rights that they had as representing states seriously. And so in this, he says, in this quote, he's arguing against those who have full rights within the United States, but have never served their country, who have never sort of taken up the cause of defending their nation, but get all of the stuff that people in Guam don't, even if those in Guam have chosen to serve the United States and sacrifice for it. And so he often had that attitude, that indignance. Sometimes people would call it arrogance. Sometimes he could speak very aggressively, but he constantly reminded that the people of Guam had sacrificed in war, and that they had served, and they were serving in the military, and that they deserved something better from the United States and what they were being given. One of the things that it took a little while for Ben Blaz to come along to was the issue of Commonwealth. So Ben Blaz's, a lot of what he came to Congress for was really just about being treated the same as other people in the United States. People in Guam are US citizens, they deserve equal treatment. But Commonwealth was a move for political status change, which focused more on equity, not equality. It was that the people of Guam didn't necessarily want to be exactly like the United States, but they wanted the ability to determine their own fate and figure out things for themselves. In the 80s, when Commonwealth was born, the Japanese sort of economy was booming. There was a lot of interest in sort of establishing new businesses, new markets, expanding Guam's economy. But all of these political and economic leaders realized that you can't necessarily do that because the US has control over Guam's economy, largely the framework for Guam's economy. One thing that they realized is that as a territory, you don't get to control your own immigration. So you don't get to limit immigration to protect your population, but you don't also get to open up immigration to bring in the workers that you need or the skilled workforce that you need. And so Blaz was not an early believer in Commonwealth, but eventually through prodding and pushing and engaging with leaders on Guam who were pushing for a better deal for Guam, he eventually came along to it. And in 1988, they had the first hearing on the Commonwealth issue for Guam. And so these are excerpts from some of the testimony. Governor Joseph Ada sort of led the delegation. And then a lot of the senators and people who were involved in this sort of each made statements, sort of talking about the need for Guam to improve its status. That the people of Guam, now Commonwealth was not independence. Commonwealth was not statehood. Commonwealth was an interim status, but it was a status which gave Guam a more defined place within the United States. So if Commonwealth had been passed in the way it was eventually written, Guam would be able to control its own immigration. There would also be a guarantee that eventually the Chamorro people would have a plebiscite where they could express what they wanted for the future of the island, whether closer to the United States or further away. And one of the things that was nice about Commonwealth, but was also one reason why it would probably never pass, was that the government of Guam wanted something called mutual consent. Mutual consent was that when the US passed a federal law, Guam would have the ability to opt out if it chose to. Because federal laws get passed, sometimes Guam wants to be a part of them, but the federal government takes them out. Sometimes Guam wants to be out of them, but the federal government pulls them in. And so Guam doesn't have a say because it doesn't even have a vote in Congress as to where it sits in sort of the web of federal laws. Mutual consent would allow Guam to say no or say yes. Say yes if something would improve Guam, say no if it would. So for example, if mutual consent existed, the United States has something called the Animal Welfare Act, which prohibits cockfighting, cruelty to animals. If there was mutual consent, then Guam could choose to be exempt from the Animal Welfare Act. It could have its own Animal Welfare Act if it wanted to, but it could also allow it so that cockfighting could still be permitted because of its status as a cultural sport and a cultural pastime. But the problem is that what happened is the US a few years ago withdrew exemptions from territories, and Guam couldn't do anything about it. You couldn't say, yes, we like this. You couldn't say, no, we don't like this, because it all happened without Guam having any say. So as Ben Blaz argued, Commonwealth is the principal issue for Guam. It is not a democratic issue, and it's not a Republican issue. It is a distinctly Guam issue with political, civil, and human rights issues in it. We on Guam paid our dues as heavily in war as in peace to prove our loyalty and pride as members of the American family. Still, we have never enjoyed equal status with other Americans, either politically or economically. This is from one of his statements in support of Commonwealth in '88. And so what's important about sort of Blaz and his statements, and this is something that continues for us today, is that serving in the US military doesn't mean that you can't criticize the US. Perhaps while you're in the military, you're not allowed to, your freedom of speech is restricted. But one thing that was nice about Blaz and the Commonwealth movement is that those who had served felt compelled that they should be treated better, that their island and their people deserve to be treated better. And rather than arguing, that we should take whatever we get and that we should be happy with it, Blaz and other veterans organized themselves to speak out in favor of Commonwealth. And they connected to other veterans across the United States who wrote letters to their Congress people saying, support the people of Guam. They've sacrificed. We know these people, they deserve to be treated better. and that sort of serving in the military didn't mean that you had to give up better treatment. It didn't mean that you have to silence yourself. It doesn't mean that you lose your connection to your land or to your island, and that actually speaking out in favor of better treatment, even pushing for independence or decolonization, those are the first things that gave birth to the United States. That type of rhetoric, those types of demands to be treated with dignity, to be treated with respect, to have the ability to self-determine. And so that was something that was very nice that came out of Blaz's discussions in the Commonwealth sort of movement, is a greater freedom and ability to talk about these things, to sort of debate these things, to push for these things. Now, Blaz spent 8 years in Congress before eventually he was defeated by Robert Underwood. Blaz, interestingly enough, even though he was representing Guam, he fell prey to some of the same things that Tony Wampat had fallen prey to before him. And that's that they, in time, became largely disconnected from the island, not sort of coming back very often, spending most of their time in the States, not really building connections to the community. And so when Robert Underwood ran against Ben Blaz, he ran on a grassroots platform connecting in the community, and he was able to defeat Ben Blaz. It was a very bitter campaign, but eventually both of them sort of, became closer working with each other on different issues. And when Robert Underwood was president of the University of Guam, I believe a year before Ben Blaz died, he invited him as an honored speaker to come to the university to sort of give a speech about his life and his thoughts and his reflections. And so in thinking about, referring back to Tun Benderu, Ben Blaz's father, in his article, Ben Blaz writes, and if you haven't seen the article CHamoru's Yearn for Freedom, you can find it online. The National Park Service has it on their website for the Guam liberation content. He writes that not everyone was happy with the Organic Act. While most of the people in Guam were jubilant with its passing, some felt it did not go far enough. My father was one of those. He railed against it, saying it did nothing more than make us second-class citizens. He took me aside one day as I was about to leave for my first assignment in the Marine Corps and asked a question that has haunted me since. We were in the air terminal on Guam, in those days a mere Quonset hut. Looking at me directly, he said, "Tell me, why are we equal in war, but not equal in peace?" I could not answer him then, and now having served 30 years in the US Marine Corps and 8 years in Congress, I still cannot. And so that question continues to sort of haunt us today, is that if you decide to serve, then you can get equal treatment, although many veterans have found that even because you come from a territory, you still don't get equal treatment. You still have restrictions in terms of your benefits. You still don't get access like others do. That Guam is one of the places that has the highest per capita in terms of veterans that have served, and it has per capita the lowest amount of spending on veterans' needs and benefits. And so, but that issue, equal in war, but not equal in peace. And it's an important reminder, because for those of us who feel that Guam is just like any other part of the United States, you have to remember what it's like if you are a part of the United States. It means that if you are unpatriotic or patriotic, you still get to be part of the United States. If you are an asshole or if you are nice, you still get to be part of the United States. If you serve in high numbers or if you serve in very low numbers in the military, you're still part of the United States. If you feel like you don't get to be a part of the United States unless you silence yourself and don't protest and don't speak out about your experiences or your needs, it means you're not really part of the United States. And so Blaz reminds us that if you are only equal when the US acknowledges your strategic value. If you're only equal when it comes time to talk about the sacrifices of soldiers, but the rest of the time you're forgotten about, that means you're not really equal. That means your island still belongs to the US. It means you're still second class. Even if you might be first class and you might be equal sometimes, the fact that at any given day, your island can be shut out from this program, your island can be forgotten for this, the military can do this or that, it means you're not really a real part of the United States. And so Blaz, using the experiences of his father, who lived at a time when, when the racism and discrimination, when the colonial attitude of the United States was really obvious and very much in your face, to then Blaz's time where it changes, but it still persists, where Guam being a possession of the United States still persists, where even if you're US citizens, Guam is something that can be forgotten. Guam is something that can be ignored, that Guam is something that can be treated beneath dignity because you're a territory, not a real part of the United States. And I forgot I was going to make a slide for it because Ben Blaz, he was a pretty good orator. And so there was one thing that he said in Congress, which then others after him, such as Robert Underwood and Madeleine Bordallo, I don't know, I haven't seen anything where the current delegate has quoted it too, but other delegates from territories too have quoted it where they say, I am a member of Congress, but not one of its members. And that refers to the status of the non-voting delegates, is you are called a member of Congress, but you are not allowed to vote, which is the defining characteristic of a member of Congress, is that you are sent to Washington, D.C., and you get to vote for your people, those that you represent. And so he would have that in his office. I am a member of Congress, but not one of its members. And then Underwood and Bordallo would both quote that when there was issues where they were being excluded from it, or the people of Guam and the territories were being ignored because they're from territories and they were being treated unfairly. I am a member of Congress, but not one of its members. So there's all of those ways that talk about what Guam is to the United States. Sometimes they say a part of and apart from. They say foreign in a domestic sense. Unincorporated territory. And so what was nice is the way that Ben Blaz connected his own experiences and the experiences of his family to help others try to understand what is wrong about our status today. What is wrong? What is missing? What do we need to do? So the second quote here, now Ben Blaz died in 2014. This is sort of an image from his funeral because he was a member of Congress. He was sort of somebody who had achieved, a high rank within the Marine Corps. He was given a military funeral with lots of honors. And the quote, the second quote down there, is from his grandfather. We survived this, who he says said it during World War II. We survived the Spaniards, we lived with the Americans, we'll survive the Japanese because this island is ours. The other quote, though, is interesting. The other quote actually comes from a Spanish governor in the 19th century, the 1800s. A chamorro is a lantern that lights a stranger's door. And this Spanish governor had used this because by the late 1800s, there was already an estimated 800 chamorros living in Honolulu, living in Hawaii. They had left the island as whalers. They had started families. They had started businesses. And what was funny is that on Guam, amongst the Spanish, chamorros had a reputation for being lazy, for being primitive, simple-minded, a lot of negative things. But in the US and in Hawaii, the independent country of Hawaii and then later Hawaii as a territory, chamorros had a stellar reputation. Chamorros were known for being hardworking. They were known for being smart, good workers, great to be around. And so the Spanish governor used this phrase to basically say that, yes, once Chamorros are away from their culture and their island, they turn into amazing people. But as long as they're here, connected to their culture and their island, there's nothing to them. So that's what that saying means. A Chamorro is a lantern that lights a stranger's door. Is that on their own island, the Chamorro provides no light. But once they leave island and get away from their language and their culture and their families and their people, suddenly they are bright, shining examples for the world. And so this is something that's always interesting, because does Ben Blas's story and the stories of others, do they provide a continuing example of this? That sort of those that leave the island, those that sort of join and serve for somebody else, as opposed to their own people and their own community, do they become shining examples, whereas those who stay behind do not? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how that is, but I know that that will be one of the tests for the Chamorro people sort of looking into the future, is can we serve our island? Can we sort of take steps to protect that which is ours? Or will we always need the structure of the United States to make it happen for us? It's something, it's a deep sort of issue that we can discuss a lot in a lot of different ways, because we see it around us. But will we always need like sort of an indirect or a disconnected sort of means in order to strive? I don't know. I don't think so, but oftentimes that's how it happens. And so what will it take for sort of future generations to feel accomplished while connected to the island, to not feel that serving something greater means leaving the island behind, or accomplishing great things means leaving the island and the people behind? To the second quote, though, because one of the ways that we can see that first quote is that feeling that you have to leave the Chamorro behind in order to accomplish big things. And I think that for part of Ben Blas's life, he may have unconsciously believed that, because a lot in his generation did believe that you have to stop, you kind of got to disconnect from the culture. Your language doesn't have any value once you get into the wider world, that who you are isn't really important. But later in his life, as he became more introspective, as he reflected back, then he came to realize that there was important value to where he came from, that his experiences were of value. That's why he wanted to write about them, that the suffering and the stories that came out of the war and the culture of the Chamorro people was beautiful, and it deserved to be celebrated. It wasn't something that you just needed to get rid of because it got in the way of your success, but it had an energy and a life force unto itself as well. And so it is interesting to see the example of somebody like Ben Blas, who achieved a great amount in the United States within the military, accomplished so much, even serving in the US Congress, and then also strongly feeling that that the Chamorro parts of him, that they were important to carry, to pass on, that they're important to remember. And so I always like this quote from his grandfather, because we should think about that too. We should think about that too, especially as we remember that the Chamorro people have been around for thousands of years in some form or another. And that I think that early on in his life, Ben Blas and many others really believed that the path for the Chamorro people ends with the United States. But I think that when they thought about that, they also thought that that means that the Chamorro part has to come to an end, that you have to that the culture has to be neutralized in some way. But eventually he came to realize that that culture and that connection to the land has power and strength too. And that is something, and even this, we survived the Spaniards, we lived with the Americans, we'll survive the Japanese because this island is ours. Remembering that connection to your homeland, that it can help you survive as long as you maintain that connection to your homeland. And even for those in the diaspora, it's an important sort of important thing to remember. As long as we can maintain our connection to the homeland, to the culture, sort of we can survive. And so, Sidzus Masi, so I think somebody had a question. Hungad, that quote was meant to be against Chamorros. It basically, and it was meant to be against their culture and their people. It was basically meant to say that a Chamorro is only valuable if they give up who they are. That once they're not around their families, once they're not around their parties, once they're not around their paris and their mullies, then they become great subjects. But as long as they're on their island, and it's a very colonial mentality. I mean, because the US also believed the same thing. They would just say it in different ways. They would call it like Guam-itis, that Guam sort of had this, there was this energy in Guam, and that even the well-meaning, decent white person would get stricken with the Guam-itis. And they would start to become lazy, and they wouldn't want to do their work. And they might start to cut corners, and they might start to just want to lay around and not. Yeah, that's true. That's true. The might be does make you gatgu sometimes. That's true. I don't know. I think cold weather makes you gatgu too. Whenever I was in really cold weather, I didn't want to do shit. I wanted to find the warmest spot and stay there. Oh no, I know. I'm kidding too. And so, but yes, so I think, so I chose to do Ben Blas today because Chamorro service in the military is a huge thing. It's a very huge thing. And what's been fascinating about it is seeing the way that Chamorros and their sense of themselves has changed in that, right? So those who were drafted or those who served after World War II, a lot of times they said they wanted to do it to pay back America for saving them. Sometimes it was to get off the island and so on. But they would feel very silenced in their service. Like you couldn't do anything. You had to just take it. Like if you were treated badly, you were just supposed to take it. You couldn't complain. But then what we see after Vietnam is Chamorros, seeing themselves in a more multiracial way. Whereas before it was whites and then everybody else. And Chamorros basically said, I don't want to be everybody else. I wish I was white, or I wish I was invisible. Because as many Chamorros who served before the war experienced, the blacks were always treated the worst, and you never wanted to be treated like the blacks. And so you wanted to be really nice to the whites so that they wouldn't treat you like one of the blacks. And a lot of those men, they didn't really like to talk about those experiences because, of course, things then changed after. But I remember one Chamorro guy who felt really insulted because when they were at Liberty once on the West Coast before the war, and they all lined up at the brothel, he was made to line up behind the blacks. And he felt so insulted that the whites put him behind the blacks because he wasn't one of them and he deserved to be treated better than them. And so those men, they lived in a very difficult time. It didn't matter how good you were, you handled butter and you carved and you peeled potatoes. You were a cook or you were a servant. There was no chance for advancement. And so you were sort of at the lowest rung of the Navy, and you wanted to be high, as high as you could in the lowest rung in the Navy. And so for a lot of them, they couldn't imagine that they could be in solidarity, open solidarity with African Americans. Now, there's other stories of Chamorros and African Americans sort of working together too and helping each other. But at that time, a lot of it was that you didn't want to be connected to them because, they were the ones that got harassed. Like if you came into port, in somewhere in the United States, they would be the ones that people would harass and you didn't want to be connected to them. But then what happens in Vietnam is that for the first time, you start to see Chamorros openly expressing solidarity with African Americans and Latinos, feeling like I am part of them. What they experience, I experience. You know, let's work together. You know, I like the way that you are speaking up for your people because I want to speak up for my people. I like the way that you are pushing back against the racism because I don't like it either. And so that's why what you have in the Vietnam era, for example, you have a lot of stories, and sometimes Chamorros don't ever really want to tell these stories. But you have stories of like Chamorros and African Americans working together to beat up their white officers or get back at their white officers. Now, of course, you're not really supposed to brag about those sorts of things, but you have lots of stories of those who feel oppressed in that situation finding ways to get back. And so, because I remember one story, I mean, I won't share his name because he's still alive, but and so he says I can't share his name until after he passes away. But and so where he was, they were stationed in Okinawa. He was in the Air Force and he worked in a machine shop, and so you know the leader, him and the other Chamorros, and there was some Filipinos and there was some Native Hawaiians. You know, they were hard workers, but they never got promoted. And there was this crew of white guys that always got the promotions, always got the favoritism and stuff like that. And they really hated them. And the leader of sort of the work crew was this very racist Southerner who would always say terrible things to the Chamorros and stuff like that. But they all just took it. Because who could you complain to and say he's saying mean things to me or you're discriminating against me? You know, you complained about it and people said you should just shut up and appreciate what America gives you. And so this one guy though, so this racist guy, one day, you know, he went to this Chamorro guy and he started to talk about how much of a whore his wife was. Because they had lots of kids and everyone on the base knew they had lots of kids. And so he started to trash his wife, you know, basically saying, you know, does she like white meat? Does she, serve the white man and stuff like that in front of everybody in sort of the machine shop. And so that was like it. The Chamorro guy had it. And so he went up to that white guy and he said, the moment you leave the base today, I'm going to kill you. And so after that, the Chamorro guys, the Filipino guys, and the Hawaiian guys, they got together and they waited outside the base for this white guy and his friends to leave. And once they left the base, the white guy saw them and said, oh, are you guys going to fight us or something? And the Chamorro guy went up to that white guy, knocked him right out on the ground. And all of his friends beat up all the other white guys, beat them all unconscious, and said, don't you ever talk about my wife ever again. You do, I will fulfill my promise and I will kill you. And so the next day, sort of the white guys had come in and they were all beaten up, right? And so the commander and the unit looked around and said, is something going on here? What's going on here? Who wants to speak up and who wants to tell me what's going on? And no one would talk. So eventually the Chamorro guy whose wife her reputation had been besmirched, he came forward and he said, I did it. And I'll do it again. He speaks down to me, he treats us badly, and he dared to speak about my wife. And if he ever does it again, he'll get it even worse. And he was prepared. Like, I'm going to get kicked out of the Air Force. I don't care. I've had enough of the way that I've been treated here. And so what was interesting though, is that the commander of the unit didn't punish him. And in fact, soon after that, he made that Chamorro the new sort of head of the unit and the work crew. And he actually made a statement and he said, because all of the Chamorro guys and the Filipino and the Hawaiian guys were smaller than the white guys, he said, there must be something great in all you tiny guys for you to kick all their asses. So he said, maybe if I put you in charge, you'll teach these these southern homeboys how to fight. And so when I was doing research with sort of Chamorro experiences of discrimination, what was very interesting is that I found so many examples of when Chamorros finally stood up for themselves. It actually led to sometimes small, sometimes significant changes. But part of it was that you can't just expect that a system which is designed to not treat you with respect, to treat you with respect by being silent. You have to be willing to speak up and fight back in some way. And even if you lose, even if it's hard, at least you show the system that you deserve more than what you're getting. And so, man, I have so many stories from my oral history research of Chamorros doing that, feeling like the system wasn't treating them well, and then just kind of taking matters into their own hands, and then coming out of it being treated better by the system. Whether violence is the answer or not, it is just interesting to sort of hear those stories. But this issue of military service is such a central part. There's even those who feel that military service is as much a part of Chamorro culture as Catholicism is a part of Chamorro culture. And it's something that we need to understand, that we need to talk about, because it does bring benefits, of course, to families, to communities. There's also downsides to it as well. There's also downsides. One of the things that we see nowadays, for example, is that the school system on Guam and that the economy itself is built in such a way that it expects thousands of people to leave the island in the military every year. So that if you, for example, when I've spoken to teachers, they say that job placement, job fairs on Guam in high schools always tend to basically be like huge military affairs. They give the military huge spaces. They let them do whatever they want, because for a lot of administrators and some teachers, if you don't know what to do with a child, if you don't know what they're going to do in life, then the military will take them. So why should we prepare them for jobs? Why should we do anything when the military can just take them? They can just join the military. And so that's why, understanding the value of the military, but also understanding what we lose because of the high levels of service. It's very important to sort of understand that, because if you have so many people serving in something, leaving the island, there's benefits, but what do we lose as a result as well? What are the impacts on lands? I always think it's one of the things that's always kind of funny to me is that the bases on Guam are always tied. People always feel that they are huge economic drivers, when bases tend to be economic depressors, and they tend to be large economic sort of dead zones. Because, for example, if you look at places within the United States, studies show that the areas around military bases are not sort of economic boom towns. They're not like hugely successful. It's not like it's not like if you have a military base in your community, it means you're guaranteed like economic booms. No, not at all. In fact, outside of bases that tend to be economically depressed. And we see the same in Guam. That's why what's funny is that people say, oh, the Philippines never should have kicked the US out of their country, the bases out of their country. But studies show that the areas that were used by the US for bases, now they make a lot more money for the Philippine economy than they did when they were bases. In Okinawa, studies show the same thing, is that in Okinawa, the bases, because Okinawa gets 10 million tourists a year, and the bases are these economic dead zones where it provides some help, to restaurants and to bars and stuff outside of the bases. But they could become like even larger as a tourist destination. But there's all of these dead economic spaces, which are military bases, where you can't expand, and you can't expand your agriculture, you can't expand your tourism industry, because of that. And Guam faces the same thing. When people wonder about if Guam could sustain itself, if it was independent. If you didn't have 1/3 of your land being US military facilities, Guam could absolutely sustain itself. But if you have 1/3 of your area being cut off from the general economy, it's harder. Even if some of the people attached to those bases do provide something for the economy, it's hard. You can't really sort of plan for your economic future when 1/3 of your island isn't something you have control over, isn't something that you can account for within your economy. And so that's why it's important that I mean, even for me, I feel very fortunate that there was never really any pressure for me to join the military. My grandfather wanted to join the military after World War II. He wanted to join the Navy because everybody else that he went to school with was joining the Navy. Because they all wanted to leave the island. They all wanted to see the world. They all wanted to get Asian girlfriends. But my grandfather was not able to join because of it's a funny story. I'll tell you another time as to why my grandfather wasn't allowed to join the Navy. But because of that, like, it's not like when I was growing up, there was this high value to military service because my grandfather hadn't served. You know, my parents didn't serve. There's one branch of my first cousins where 4 out of 5 of the siblings were in the military, but that's because, you know, their father's influence, not necessarily our family's influence. But and so, yeah, for me, you know, but I also understand that my perspective is not everybody's perspective, and that the military has given a lot of opportunities to people, that it has developed Guam in certain ways, that it provides a value within the United States, whether a value in terms of Guam getting more federal spending for certain things, or whether people feeling more comfortable within the United States because you can claim that there's this patriotic place where people serve. You know, those are parts of Chamorro identity today. But what I always want to encourage people is that if serving in the US military means that you have to silence yourself or stay silent when your community has needs, then it's not serving your community. If your connection to the United States, feeling like you are an American, requires that you be silent for the Chamorro side, which may still have quests for justice that need to be met, then what is the value of being an American if it means that the Chamorro is suppressed in you? Because always remember that, you know, for those of us that are Chamorro, that is something that has been around for thousands of years. That's something that's there, predates the United States, and it's something that can coexist within the United States, but it's also something that for a long time people have felt has to be minimized in relation to the United States. And so, yeah, that's why I like Ben Bloss's example, is because after he was done serving and he looked back on his life, then he realized that a lot of the things that he hadn't appreciated were actually really valuable to him. Right? And so if you haven't had a chance to read his book, Nihita Haso, it's really nice because it's really like a love letter. It's really like an inspirational story about what him and all of the Chamorro people went through and why future generations shouldn't forget it. Because some of the best that is in the Chamorro people came out in the war. Whether those who sacrificed, you know, those who used their ingenuity to adapt and survive, you know, those who were selfless, some of the best parts came out in that. And so I'm glad that he returned to his roots towards the end. Because like when the longest conversation that I had with him was it was like 15 years ago on a Liberation Day. And it was different. It was interesting to meet him in person and talk to him at that time versus if I had met him 20 years earlier, I might not have liked talking to him as much because he might have had a very different perspective. But when I met him, he had already he was writing more, he was researching, and he was very much about like, you know, that Chamorros should be treated with dignity. And so finding a way to balance that out. And so a lot of these presentations, a lot of these figures, especially as we get into closer to today, a lot of it comes down to what is our relationship to the United States, right? That the United States is this massive, huge force, and it would be very easy for the Chamorro to become lost in that massive sort of, right? Because if you think about what the Chamorro is in the United States, if you look at Netflix, right, there's 2,000 films and you're going through the queues, endlessly scrolling, right? What is the Chamorro? The Chamorro would just be like one movie out of 2,000. And many people may watch Netflix every day and they may never actually get to that movie. So they may never actually get to the Chamorro and their place within the United States. And so a lot of this is just reminding ourselves that our history, our identity, our culture, our language, that if we think these things are important, then we need to make sure that they survive. Because if we don't, they're gonna disappear. Like that one Adam Sandler movie you're trying to watch before it left Netflix. You go there one day, I swore there was like this weird Chamorro movie. I swore it's gone. Oh well, maybe no one wanted to watch it. That's why it's gone. And so thinking then about these historical figures and what they did to negotiate colonialism, negotiate their own identity, but also the way that they give models for us to think about how we can approach our own identities and about how we can approach the same issues that they had in terms of our language, our culture, our history. Right. Are there any other questions? Are there any other questions? I definitely encourage you. The books that I shared with you from Ben Bloss, you can usually find them on eBay. I haven't seen them on Amazon though. But I know that sometimes they're for sale in bestseller on Guam and Faith Bookstore.
Can you share the names of the books again? I only got the Nihita Hasu. I didn't get the other ones.
Estague Guam, A Special Place in the Sun. Hold on. Visita Guam, A Special Place in the Sun. It may be backwards to you. But Visita Guam, A Special Place in the Sun. And then Visita Guam, Nihita Hasu, Let Us Remember. Yeah, this is more people know this one because he later turned it into the TV series. But I actually like this one more because this one has it's more heartfelt. And he even at the end, although very few people get there, he even at the end dedicates it to his mother, Sitanrita.
So I just wanted to express how I appreciate you exposing us to a Chamorro person who has found themselves in these systems of colonization and still been able to come out of that, because I often find myself butting heads with family members who succumb to these ways of life, right? Like who believe this patriotism and serve in the military wholeheartedly. And I almost feel like it's hopeless, like that, like how will I ever get them to see this? So just being exposed to this is so magical for my thought processes right now.
Yeah, I think no, I think it's, yeah, it's like I mean, I've been thinking a lot about Operation Christmas Drop, the Netflix movie, because, and if you haven't watched it, put forward, go and watch it before it leaves Netflix. And so, but so now you can, there's some people that really love that movie. There's some people that really absolutely hate that movie. And then there's a lot of people that are closer to the middle, right? But one of the things that we should remember, because I was arguing with some of my friends recently about this, because I didn't really like the movie. I didn't really like the movie on a lot of levels. I still giggled and I laughed. The gecko was hysterical. And I still liked it when I saw some of my former students. I saw my cousin who was in it, and I was like, and they were playing a CHamoru song in the background, and I was like, oh, that's really nice, at least that. But so we always have to remember that even if you are critical of something, if it is still, and you don't like something, if for most people it is a central part of their identity, then you can't just expect them to understand your critiques. So like, because I've been dealing with lots of people who don't understand, like, how come my family doesn't hate Operation Christmas Drop? Like, I hate it. How come my family doesn't? And I'm like, well, you got to remember, you are probably thinking that because the 200 people you're friends with on Twitter all hate it, that everybody hates it, right? Or because, the 300 people that follow you on Instagram don't seem to like it, then of course everybody hates it, right? Everyone is critical because no. But that's not, the world doesn't begin and end with your followers on social media. In fact, that's a tiny, minute, just like barely like a thumbnail of the world, right? And so I said, so think about it from this perspective. As an average person in the world, you are taught to think that a movie is just a movie, and you are taught to think that the military is awesome. So then if you put into your family WhatsApp chat, Operation Christmas Drop is military propaganda and it's violence against our people, why would any of your family members be able to understand what you're saying? Because everything in their life has taught them that a movie is just a movie and that the military is awesome. And so, but this is why, for me, we have to always focus on, you can't ever focus on just attacking something like that, because you also have to focus on how we shouldn't necessarily like these things, because it's also a reminder that we need to build ourselves up, right? So for me, I'm like, yeah, make more shitty movies like Operation Christmas Drop if it can help inspire us to make our own movies and to stop letting other people tell us who we are. If it can do that, don't hate on the people necessarily that were involved in it. Don't hate on them like they're sort of traitors to the Chamorro people, but most importantly, remember that unless, as as the African proverb goes, until lions have their own historians, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Which means if the focus isn't that, yes, this sucks, but it's a reminder that we need to build ourselves up. And so but if it's always just this like negative, critical thing, but that also goes to the military too, which is like, yes, the military offers opportunities, but we also need to sort of think about what it might take away. And it's harder to get to those things. But one thing that I found is that you can reach those people. But like with Ben Blas, one of the things that made Ben Blas very critical though, is that he was like this shining minority officer. So he was promoted up And in some ways, people around him felt that he shouldn't have been promoted, but it was because things were changing and they wanted minority officers to be promoted. So there were some of his contemporaries who felt like he didn't deserve to be promoted. But he experienced lots of racism over the course of his life. He wouldn't really talk about it a lot. He displaced a lot of it onto his father, interestingly enough. So when he writes about what his father said, a lot of times he's actually speaking for himself through the voice of his father. But when he was in Congress, a lot of it came out. A lot of his anger over how he had been treated. And he wouldn't necessarily talk about it directly, but in the way that he talked about the people of Guam being mistreated and deserving better, he was kind of talking about himself. And so one thing that I find for helping people understand, helping people be more critical and open-minded about the military, is that they have to connect their experiences to it. Like that you know, if in a situation like that, right, you're supposed to feel that you're not good enough for the system. That's the problem. You haven't proven yourself enough for the system, and that's the problem. You haven't gotten rid of your heritage enough, and that's the problem. You haven't learned to talk the way that they talk, and that's the problem. That's the way you're supposed to. That was the way that our parents and our grandparents, a lot of them felt like that's how you get ahead, right? Is that you subtract, you take chunks of your own flesh out, and once you've gotten rid of the brown and the blood, right? Then your skin and your persona is white enough so that you'll be okay and that they'll accept you, right? But unfortunately, a lot of people that have been through stuff like that, they struggle to connect it to a larger societal issue, right? So that was what was different about the Chamorros during the Vietnam War, who first started to publicly talk about being discriminated against. Chamorros had always been discriminated against, but they never felt like there was anything. They might complain to each other about it. They might want to like beat somebody up behind the scenes to get back at it, but they would never speak openly about it because they couldn't connect it into a larger structural issue to make them feel something larger than just it being this frustrating, small, oppressive thing. But that's the problem with a lot of people who serve. I mean, I remember when I interviewed a Chamorro woman who was like a helicopter pilot, and she had been discriminated against. Her and other women had been denied combat medals because they had been aircraft helicopter pilots, but this was at a time when women were not allowed to serve in combat roles. But they had been in combat, and they had been shot at, they had been wounded, they had flown as many missions as the men who had gotten the medal, and so they felt like they deserved it, and they were denied it. And eventually they had to go to Congress, and they had to lobby, and eventually Congress pushed the military to give them their medals. But when I asked that woman, did you experience discrimination in the military? She said, no, I didn't. Like, you didn't experience discrimination? No, not at all, no. And like, but what about not getting the medal? No, I mean, it was, eventually we got it. And it's like, but that was discrimination. No, I wasn't discriminated against. No. And it was an interesting thing because she had told me her story of discrimination. But when it came to connecting it to a concept, which would mean it's larger than just her personal experience. And for a lot of Chamorros, they struggle with making that connection. They struggle with, and that's why, you know, I've had a lot of students over the years who are in the military. And I got an email last week from one of them who basically, told me they've been in the Army. In fact, they're still in the Army, I think. I think he's still in the Army. That he had taken my Guam history class, years ago, and that only now he was realizing that sort of when I was talking about the historical experiences of Chamorros, and that when I had talked about Angel Santos and what he had gone through, that he is going through the same sort of things. And that realizing that like that sort of what activists do is just what regular people do, except when they're angry and they want to change the world to make it better. And so, and I'm always happy when somebody does that, but it's hard. You can't force people to make those connections, but you have to help them understand those connections. And so I found it's easier with those who have been in the military versus those who have not, because those who have been in the military usually have experiences that you can help them understand that this maybe wasn't right. It wasn't fair. This isn't necessarily good. But if they haven't been in the military and they've just been a beneficiary of like benefits, then it's harder to get them to understand it because they just see all these positives, right? So I used to have like debates in my Guam history class. And when the military buildup was a very big issue about 10 years ago, you would have young people who wanted to join the military saying that we should support the buildup versus those who had been in the military saying that we shouldn't support the buildup. And part of it was because those who hadn't joined yet were just thinking about how I get my girlfriend pregnant, everything's taken care of. You know, all healthcare is taken care of, commissary privileges, nice. But you had then those who had been in the military benefiting from those things. Oftentimes it paid for their tuition to be in the class, but also realizing that it takes you away from your island, that you end up having to live somebody else's life for a long time, you know, and that you may be, and that there's other things that may happen to you and that you're not told about what you may need to do. Because this was, because I had some students who had been like in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of them basically, you know, they would talk to the younger people who have this rosy picture of the military and tell them, what are you talking about? You know, and they would say, you know, if I love those that I served with, I'm happy I served, but if I could do it again, I would have stayed on Guam. You know, instead of going off to in the military for 10 years, leaving the island behind, you know. And so for me, a lot of it is finding ways to help people understand that what they may have experienced, whether they may feel it's small, they may feel it's not important, but just connecting it to something larger. So, and then it kind of opens them up. Like I've met so many veterans, older veterans, who if you ask them, have you been discriminated against? They would say no. And then years later, they look and they realize that of course they've been discriminated in terms of their benefits for decades. And that if they had thought about it, and if they had connected it earlier, they could have fought. Because I was at a meeting of some vets, and it was because these were Vietnam War vets who had found out that they were entitled to a federal benefit that they had been denied for 30 years. That the VA had told them that because they lived on Guam, they were not entitled to it. And they had been told this for 30 years. In truth, they had been entitled to it the entire time. The local VA just didn't want to do the work because the local VA is part of the Hawaii VA, and the Hawaii VA serves Hawaii, and they always underfund Guam. And if there's something where it's extra work for Hawaii to give something to Guam, they tend not to do it. And it's always been like that. And so, and these vets were so angry because some of these benefits were about healthcare, some of these were about housing loans, and they were entitled to all of them. But because they didn't connect it to mistreatment, because they didn't think that, is it right that I'm denied this, even though I served? Is it right that I bled for America, but America won't give me what it gives to other vets? And so that's why the enemy here is really that silencing. If your relatives feel that serving in the military means that they have to be silent on things, that's not good. It's not good in general. It's not good for Chamorros. It's not good for any people if you feel that. But one thing that's different for Chamorros versus if you're, you know, white or black or Latino or something else, is that Chamorros have a more direct relationship with the military than just about anyone else. We have contamination issues because of the military. We have discrimination issues. the landlessness on Guam is tied to the military because of the military land takings after the war. And so it's very important that we understand our relationship to the military, because even if you aren't in it, the military is such an important part of the lives of the Chamorro people, even if you're not directly in it. It's interesting, military and Catholic Church. Even if you're not Catholic, the Catholic Church is still such a big, pervasive part of Chamorro culture. Same with the military. So, but yes, good luck. Good luck talking to your family about those sorts of things. But always just, for me, I always just have to remember, I always just have to remember that the way that I see the world is not the way that anybody else sees the world. And so I need to find a way, find what common ground is there between us so that I can help them understand some of what I feel, but that they may not use the words that I use, right? But so that's why calling like Operation Christmas Drop propaganda isn't going to reach most people, right? But there's still ways that you could get them to understand it, right? There's still some that's kind of like, how come they just showed the military? You know, that's not right. Or one thing that I always like to remind people is that actually the military does the drops, but Operation Christmas Drop was started by the Chamorro people who wanted to donate to the other islands to help them around Christmas. But they didn't have the ability to get out to those islands. And so they petitioned the military to do it. For a very long time, the military didn't like doing it. They didn't want to do it, but because they had wars to fight. But now that the military doesn't have as many wars to fight, it uses this as this big international humanitarian thing that they do. And it allows them to do certain types of training that they don't get to do otherwise. And they get to work with the militaries from other countries. So now the military loves it, but it actually came from a desire from Chamorros connected to the Catholic Church to provide donations to the people in the other islands. And so I got some people that really liked it to hate it after talking to them about that. I was like, yeah, you know what? Where was the church? You know, they should have had the church. This really started with the church, and people are like, oh, I didn't know that. Yes. What are they saying? We're heathens? We're savages? No. Yeah. Anyways. But yeah. And so, no, people that were in the States also received reparations. But the problem was that there was no strong effort to get the message out to those in the States, because they're often spread apart so much. Like they're spread out all over. So yes, there was probably thousands of people. And one of the problems, and whether you like the recently elected, re-elected delegate or not, one of the problems with him though is that Madeleine Berdaliu passed the law, Mike St. Nicholas passed the correction so that people could be paid, but he has not done anything to try to reopen the process so that those thousands who didn't get anything can still be compensated. He has done nothing to do that. And people have been pushing him, he doesn't respond. But yeah, so if you are if you have a family member who is not compensated, who didn't know about it, then you should definitely contact his office, because it's something that he needs to do. And he's made an excuse once saying that we shouldn't try to compensate them from Congress, we should try to do it locally. If that's his position, then he needs to take the lead and work with the local government to make it happen. And so it is a sad issue, the issue of war reparations. It was something that Ben Blas, I didn't put that in there, but it was something that he was very sore about, because he had gotten war reparations to almost the very end, but then it didn't happen for a couple different reasons. One of them being that the local government was upset that the deal that had been made in Congress was because they were trying to push through Chamorro reparations when reparations for Japanese who were interned in World War II was going to happen. So that's how Congress works, is that oftentimes a territory can't get something on its own, but if something is going through, you can attach it on and you can use the momentum to push something else through. So Blaz, who had close connections to a lot of the members in the Senate and the Congress who were also World War II survivors or those who had served in World War II, they had pushed it through where it was going to happen. But part of the deal was that Chamorros could not receive more than what Japanese Americans were getting. That there was no way that it could happen, that Chamorros had to get less. So it could get through. And this was in the early 90s. So tens of thousands of people would have gotten compensated under it. But the problem was that the reward for the Japanese was the ceiling for Chamorros, and then it got lower from there. So that's why, for example, 25,000, 5,000, 10,000, all of it was less than what Japanese received for their compensation. And the local government was incensed at that and demanded that Chamorros received more. And it ended the process right there. It couldn't go forward because of that. And Ben Blaz was angry about that for a very long time, because they could have gotten it through at that time. It would have happened. But the local government really felt like they could get a better deal. But it just never materialized. So, and it's unlikely to happen. It's unlikely to happen from the US. Even the compensation that did happen, it only happened with Guam's own money. That's the unfortunate thing about it, is that the federal government only passed it because it is being paid with money that Guam was already going to get from the federal government. So sad. Oh, war reparations issue pisses me off. And so, Vinny, if you're looking for Guam Chamorro books, of course, Gerard Affligui has lots of books. UOG Press also has lots of books. UOG Press, actually, Gerard Affligui has lots and lots of books. Basic books like Shapes, Colors, Vehicles, Emotions. UOG Press has less than half a dozen kids' books, though. And so Gerard Affligui has a few that have a narrative. All the UOG Press ones have narratives. Oh man, now I'm all worked up. Now I'm all angry thinking about war reparations. Damn, my grandfather was like, "We're never going to see war reparations." He was right. He died. He died before they got it. And so, anyways, Sidus Masi no todus hamzu. I hope you have a happy, if you call it Thanksgiving, if you call it thanks-taking, if you call it Biba Indigenous People Day, whatever you call it, just remember that we all have things to be thankful for. And so, just we've got two sessions left. Hamzumas. Just este que otro cibada. Spets it up. All right, Myla, by who? I'm going. Nita.